Hi, everyone, and welcome to Alpine Intel's The Savvy Adjuster podcast, where we discuss the property loss topics that are important to adjusters with the experts who know them best. I'm your host, Senior Account Manager Chris Nichols. Now, if you don't already know, Alpine Intel is a single source for property assessments and innovation through our operating brands, which are HVACI, Strike Check, National Fire Experts, Donut Engineering, Component Testing Laboratories, VRC Investigations, and Tech Loss. Our expert teams can provide high quality solutions to a variety of property loss questions. Today, I'm welcoming Alpine Intel's Director of Customer Education, Jay Dykstra, and Donan's Principal Forensic Engineer, Rich Grimshaw, back to the podcast to talk about how updates to regulations can impact carriers and, of course, their assessment partners. Now, just a quick disclaimer before we jump in, just as each claim is unique, regulations can vary between states, cities, even counties, depending on what they've adopted. So in this podcast, we'll primarily be talking about national codes. What we discuss, obviously, is not a complete list. And as always, it's important to get an expert assessment to make sure you have the facts you need to make your settlement decision. Now, before we dive into the episode, let's get to know our guests a little bit better. Now, I mentioned this before. You're coming back. You're veterans of the podcast. But for those unfamiliar with your backgrounds, we'd love to hear a little bit more about that. So, Jay, if we can start with you, could you share a little bit about not only your background in general, but your experience as it pertains to regulatory concerns?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So my background's as an adjuster. And I still kind of, when I wake up in the morning, I still kind of feel like an adjuster. I think like an adjuster, and I talk like an adjuster. I think that helps resonate when I work with adjusters. I handled claims in the field, residential claims, commercial claims. I traveled around the country on catastrophe duty. Pretty much saw them all out there. After that experience, I was a claims trainer for a top 10 carrier for about 7 years. And during that time, I helped revamp a lot of their training programs, including courses that included a lot of code items in them, like HVAC training classes, roofing classes, electrical classes, things like that. So very involved with the code regulation side of it from a training standpoint. And then for about the last 6 years, I've been here at Alpine Intel. I've been the leader of our technical education program. We've developed over 20 technical courses. Many or most of them have some part to do with regulations and codes, and a lot of things going on with that. And we, kind of consider ourselves one of the leaders in education out there. I was just looking at our statistics recently, and we are coming up right on the mark of having over 100,000 attendees at our training classes. I think that speaks for itself as how we're one of the leaders out there in the training space, including training about codes and regulations.
Awesome. Well, appreciate you joining again. And Rich, same question to you. I know you've been here before, but for those that don't know, can you speak a little bit to your background in general and really your experience with regulatory changes?
Sure, Chris. Thank you. So I started working with building codes in 1975. I was freshly graduated as a civil engineer, and I was designing things. I was an engineer in training, not yet a professional engineer. And our use of the building codes at that time as a designer were to look at the loads that we had to put on a structure. How much weight does this thing have to hold up, and how strong is the wind that blows that we have to withstand, and things like that. Now, I would also work with architects and mechanical engineers who were designing the HVAC equipment, and the electrical engineers, and I could see how they were working with the codes to do other parts of the whole building or structure, whatever the heck it was. After that, I got into construction, and as a contractor, I had a different view of the codes. I no longer had to apply these provisions to whatever it is I was designing for a client, but I had to be aware of what the code provisions were to make sure that whatever we built was going to pass. And I also got a chance to work a lot with the building inspectors, who, of course, were very conversant with the codes. Each of them would come out with their own discipline, and they knew a lot about every single one of them. So I got a chance to interpret it from that standpoint. But now in forensics, we look at codes from an entirely different point of view, because we're not dealing with the code that is with us right at this time, as I did in design and construction, but rather, how old is this building, and what code was in effect at that time, and does it still apply? And how do we interpret all of these things in light of an insurance policy and potential liability, et cetera. So I've had a chance to look at a lot of building codes from a lot of different ways, and I can tell you one thing for certain. They are not easy to read and understand. That I can tell you with absolute certainty. Everything else is kind of up in the air.
Well, we appreciate again the both of you for being involved in this podcast. We are in good hands with your experience, and I'd like to dive in. But before we kind of get into the details about specific regulations, let's talk about why these rules and guidelines should be on an adjuster's radar. Jace, we'll start with you. What are some ways that an update to regulations might affect a settlement decision?
Yeah, good point. So regarding regulations, we're using that term a lot. I think I've said it earlier, but going back to an adjuster's level, they're probably going to be using the word code and code upgrade, whether we're talking about regulations or whatever. But remember, there could be policy ramifications with this in respect to code upgrades. And of course, Alpine Intel and our operating brands, we don't get involved with, opining or talking about coverage or things like that. It's just not part of, we just give an objective assessment. But as a past adjuster, I certainly realize the policy and the policy language is definitely going to play into that. Code upgrades may or may not be covered. They may be limited if they are covered and things like that. So from an adjuster standpoint, they absolutely have to have that front of mind all the time while they're going through their full claim process. With that being said, I bet most adjusters listening today that are handling property damage claims, they're probably regularly hearing from the contractors about why there's a code upgrade on that particular loss or why they have to do a betterment or things like that. They're probably going to be quoting codes out there, that being the contractors. They may be real, they may be fictitious, they might actually be real but not apply because they're not in that jurisdiction and things like that. So the challenge remains whether the quoted code applies, doesn't apply, changes the facts, changes the settlement and things like that. So adjusters really need to be up on that. They need to know how to be able to do research. They need to know where to find good help. Obviously going to the local code office or the building department, the code official who's making that final decision that Rich was just talking about, they're probably your best. If you can get to that person, that's probably your best source to make sure you're knowing what's going to pass, what's not going to pass in this particular claim. But anyway, yeah, it's front of mind for all adjusters all the time with changes and ongoing codes and what might apply and what might not apply.
Well, I appreciate that. And spoiler alert, we will be getting into some of those regulation changes that will, in fact, hopefully help adjusters work their claims a little bit more efficiently here in the future. Rich, would you mind touching on a little bit of the fact that while they should be aware of these big changes that happen throughout the days, weeks, months, adjusters don't necessarily have to be experts on regulations, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, I think that would be a huge challenge to be an expert on the regulations because they have to know about insurance stuff. And that's hard enough as it is. To take on the additional burden of understanding all the building codes, I think that would be tough. I want to go back to the word regulations, though, as Jay touched on that, and it brought something to mind. The building code itself, I don't I don't think of it as regulations. It's rules that say you have to do this. In this situation, you have to do this. And if that's modified by this thing, then you have to do this. And these codes are put together by groups that represent the whole nation. But the regulation part comes from the local building place, whether that's a county or a state. Some government body is going to pass a law, and that will be the regulation. And the law says that we adopt this building code. And they may say we adopt this building code with the following exceptions. We're going to take out chapter 9 and not do that, or we're going to add this amendment. So the interpretation of the code, the application of the code happens at a local level rather than a national level. And again, for one adjuster to understand how that may change from one state to another makes it really, really complicated.
Well, and I think Jay touched on it earlier as well. We're going to be talking kind of in broad terms about national regulations, but it is important, as you mentioned, Rich, to drill down to a state and even a county level to see what specific regulations and rules they have. But we're talking a lot about adjusters, but Rich, we'll stay with you. So For those who are performing the assessments, like the engineers we have, fire investigators, technicians that work for Alpine Intel, what do these regulations mean?
Well, they mean that there are some rules that may or may not apply. Uh, and it depends on what kind of situation you're faced. I'm going to work with stairs. I find stairs interesting, and there's something that we all have to go up and down. But it turns out that there's a whole lot of rules about how stairs are supposed to be built, and those rules have changed over time. When I started out doing stairs in 1975 and 76, there weren't very many rules, and they were real easy to follow. But today, there's all kinds of rules for how high the riser can be, how wide the tread can be, what kind of nosing there can be on it, how much headroom there has to be, how the guardrails are reinforced, and how far apart the balusters can be. And there are even regulations now regarding how much illumination there must be at the top and the bottom of a stair, something not often considered. And so it's good to know that for right now if you're going to build something new. But if you're dealing with a house or a commercial building that is 40 or 50 years old, or maybe even 80 or 100 years old, and you have to make a modification or rebuild a place where there is a stair, how are you supposed to do that? How do you know what it's supposed to be built like? The contractor is probably going to say, well, let's build it according to the current code because that's what he knows, okay? And he wants to do that. But maybe you don't have to, because maybe the building official says, this is a minor adjustment that we're making to this building, and there's no reason that we have to make that current adhere to the current code. Or the building official may take a totally different view, and they want everything to be brought to the current standards. And it's that part of the code interpretation process that gets a little squirrely. What is the local building official going to require? And that's where either you want to have a good relationship with them so that you can ask, or you want to get an expert who knows the local building official and can talk with them and get their attention and try to get a determination as to what you need to do to rebuild this thing.
Sure. Well, Jay, you mentioned that you've been on the adjuster side, right? And I know you're very into Alpine Intel service levels, HVACI, strike check, and know kind of the ins and outs of them. Can you talk a little bit about what happens basically before and after an assessment for HVACI and strike check specifically, and maybe how a replacement that's suggested by a local contractor, and maybe their incorrect understanding of regulations isn't always necessarily necessary in some case, specifically maybe on the HVACI side of things?
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there, a lot going on there, but really it comes back to is they have to be the experts, right? So these technicians, electricians working for HVACI strike check, I mean, they're gonna have to be licensed, they're gonna have to be vetted, they're gonna have to be tested in their rightful fields, right? They're gonna have to be approved, and they're gonna have to be up to speed on these regulations and these codes we've been talking about so far in their specific expertise. Again, even some of these technicians, electricians, things like that are only going to know their specific area, right? They can't know everything either. There could be HVAC codes and regulations. There could be plumbing. There could be electrical system codes. Their pools and hot tubs might have their own items. What about solar panels? That's a big one out there nowadays. And what's going on with that? Even things like well pumps and all these other specialty systems that are related to our homes and businesses all might have related codes, and the experts dealing with that, the experts being the technicians working on them and the people doing the assessments, they're going to need to know those as well. But also for HVACI and strike check, we have internal processing teams. So after the on-site inspection's done, it comes in and it gets a second look. On the backside of that, we have resolution teams, because we know not everything's going to go perfect on every one. Maybe the adjuster just needs some more language they can understand on what this code means and things like that, so they can pass it along to the policyholder. And so we have a resolution team. So they can help on the back end as well. Very, very high technical team that can help outline that for the adjuster. And of course, our engineers, our fire investigators, stuff like that, they can be available after the fact as well to give their specialty, their background, their expertise to why that was in the reports we have written. So.
Sure. Well, and I think it speaks to the value for an adjuster to partner with a partner like Alpine Intel. It sounds like we're very well versed in rules, regulations, all that other good stuff, and have the back end support as well. If there are questions on reports, we can support them in their questions, get their questions answered, so they can move the claim through the life cycle. So, Rich, I'll bounce back to you for the next question. What are some of the documents, or maybe even organizations, adjusters should be aware of that may be referenced when experts are writing their reports or recommendations? People like the EPA or NFPA. Can you speak a little bit to kind of some documents and maybe organizations adjusters should be aware of out there?
Uh, EPA is a government agency. It doesn't have a lot to do with building codes, but they certainly have a lot of regulations. And a lot of those regulations may have an impact on adjusting a claim, especially if it's for a commercial ongoing business that involves lots of stuff that gets out into the environment. A building code wouldn't be involved. But associations that are usually attached to building codes are ASTM standards, American Society for Testing and Materials, uh, the National Electric Code, NEC, the National Plumbing Code, MPC, the Fire Protection Agency, NFPA. Those are all organizations that promulgate standards that are usually incorporated into a building code by reference. The code may say, we by reference incorporate this certain standard from National Fire Protection Association into this. And so you've got to adhere to our regulations, except where they may conflict with theirs, in which case theirs governs. So now you need to know that. And it's not as easy as opening up the code book and reading through it to this paragraph and figuring out where to go next. It's very complicated. Uh, Part of me wants to say it's intentionally made complicated. There's some job security there, but I don't think so. It's just that there are so many interests involved, even in something as simple as a residential structure, that you just have to be very adept at interpreting and understanding all of them so that it comes together and your building official in the end can say, yes, this is a good job. We will allow someone to live there because it is a safe place that's not going to hurt anybody. And they then pass it on to the consumer, the person who buys the house, and they feel good because they know that the house isn't going to fall down or sink into a hole or something.
And just a quick question, as far as the cadence that regulations are updated, are they all kind of on the same cadence, or can I assume that all of these different organizations have a different cadence, whether it's every 2 years, 3 years, every year? Is that a correct assumption? Kind of they're all over the place on that?
Yes, each one has their own cadence, which comes from many years of whatever. The national building codes, both the International Residential Code and the International Building Code. The building code would apply to commercial structures. The residential code, the IRC, that would apply to residences and multi-unit buildings, usually 3 stories or less. They have a code cycle of about 3 years, but the National Electric Code, I think, has a different cycle. And they all go on different ones, but they do usually get updated every 3 to 5 years, if not more frequently.
Sure. Yeah, just curious about that. It seems like again, a lot of organizations out there. I'm sure they have their own ways of doing things. So it speaks to the fact again of getting with a professional partner like Alpine Intel who knows all of those regulations and can speak to those.
Yeah, it does. I'd like to though focus not so much on the short-term change because I don't think we're affected so much by the change that happens today or this year, this code cycle. The code changes that have happened over the last, let's say, 5 or 6 cycles, maybe 18 or 22 years or so, that's probably going to affect us because if you're working with an older home and our housing stock in the United States is getting older, then chances are that home that was built in the 1970s or the 1960s, if it has major damage to it, is going to have to be rebuilt more or less to today's standards. And it's that big gap in time that's going to account for most of the change, not so much the change between 2 code cycles, but the change the accumulated changes between many code cycles. And that's where you need to be careful.
Sure. Well, with all the different documents and organizations out there, which seems like there's a lot of them, we're obviously not going to be able to cover everything today, but would love to hit a couple of highlights, if you will. Jay, we'll come back to you. I know I've personally read some of Alpine Intel's educational resources, specifically about the AIM Act and how it affects refrigerants that can show up in HVAC claims. Still seems like a little bit of a complex issue. So, could you shed a little bit of light on what it means for insurers and, of course, their policyholders?
Sure. So I think there's a bigger picture there. So I'll touch a little bit about that. But HVAC codes and regulations, again, these are federal regulations of the ones we're going to talk about here. They're some of the most complex and confusing things out there. We mentioned the bodies that might be involved, like the EPA, and we're going to talk about the DOE as well. But the EPA, has a lot of things going on. You might hear adjusters might hear terms out there like the Montreal Protocol. They might hear things like that was dealing with the phase out of R22 refrigerant. They might hear things like the Kigali Amendment. So they're hearing all these crazy things out there. The Kigali Amendments now, in addition to the Montreal Protocol, where we're phasing out R410A. So that's where we now have this AIM Act. So the AIM Act is the EPA's basically law they passed on how they're going to deal with this Kigali Amendment. And that's where they're phasing out, or they call it phasing down. It's really going to be phasing out of R410A refrigerant. So that's our current standard out there with refrigeration, and especially in split systems, small package units, and things like that. So to hear that we just went through a 15-year cycle to phase out R22 to now be phasing out R410A, super confusing for adjusters. And like I said, if it was 15 years for R22 phase out, the R410A is going to go at light speed. I mean, we're going to have changes coming as early as 2025. So we're going to have to now introduce new refrigerants, right? So we're going to get into, and there's a lot of other refrigerants out there, but we're going to get into these other refrigerants like R32, the adjusters are going to start hearing about. You're going to start hearing about R454B. And it's really going to depend on what kind of equipment we're dealing with. We're going to, might be dealing with what manufacturer we're dealing with, as opposed to which way they're going to go on these. But super confusing out there. A lot of changes coming in 2025. The poor adjusters out there are going to be hearing that same old thing as, R410A is illegal. You can't use it. We have to upgrade. There's that word upgrade that they're going to hear consistently. We have to upgrade, or we have to change out the entire system because of this new regulation that we can't use R410A. That's only about half true, right? We are phasing out R410A. They are still going to be allowing some repairs to R410A systems. But instead of dealing with 2 refrigerants, there's now going to be 4. So, and it's a complicated topic already, being an HVAC system. So the adjusters are going to have to pay close attention. Again, know where to get your help out there. Ask more questions, and don't just take it on face value when somebody out there just says, that's illegal. It got passed in January 1, 2025, and I have to put in a whole new $12,000 system. So, put the brakes on it, slow it down, ask more questions, ask about repairs, which per this AIM Act are able to be done indefinitely. I think that's the actual word in it, is repairs can be done indefinitely. So think repair versus replace on these things. And sometimes that does forego having to do a greater a change, whether it's a code or a regulation, if you can repair something rather than have to fully replace it, especially in the HVAC world.
Sure. Yeah.
Hopefully that helps. I know that's confusing.
No, it's getting less confusing by the day, and being on the sales team, I do field a lot of phone calls throughout the week from adjusters asking those same questions. A local contractor stated this thing's got to be fully replaced as opposed to being repaired because of new refrigerant changes. That's a good opportunity for me to share that information with them, as well as point them to our webinars, which your team does a fantastic job of hosting. And I believe we've got an HVACI 101 course that speaks to those, those specific changes. So for everyone who wants a little bit more deeper dive into that, you can go to Alpine Intel's resource library. Pre-recorded version of that is right up there, and that should help you. with your understanding, or at least give you a little bit more understanding about these refrigerant phases that are coming down the road. So Rich, we'll flip over to engineering. My understanding, the International Building Code was updated, I believe, this year in 2024, and
Yeah.
so what are some of the big changes that adjusters should know as they're dealing with their structural claims in regards to this building code update?
There's not much in the code updates recently that really have much of an effect. Let's go with the IBC first. That's the commercial code. They added some special requirements for resisting tornadic winds, winds from tornadoes, but it's restricted to buildings that are very important and in certain geographic areas, and only some building components have to resist these higher loads from tornadoes. So that's not the kind of thing that's going to crop up very often at all, but it is the kind of thing that creeps in. I think more important is some things that have been happening in the International Residential Code, the IRC, building homes and apartments or family type. What am I thinking of? Apartment building. Let's just go with that. Multifamily. That's it. Um, Over the years, that code has been getting more and more picky about how these buildings resist lateral loads like wind and earthquake. And so, again, if you're looking at a building that was built maybe in the 70s or 80s or before that, when these kinds of considerations just weren't there, you had a certain geometry to your buildings that allowed for a lot of open spaces, a lot of windows, and so forth. And if you had to rebuild that today, you might not be able to build it the same way it was before, because now it has some additional requirements for being able to resist lateral loads. And that means maybe some windows go away, maybe some walls have to be a little bit longer because they were too wiggly. Okay, that kind of stuff. So just be aware that that's there. Another thing that has happened recently, and it's this code change in the IRC, is that they've addressed the concept of accessory dwelling units, ADUs. Now, ADUs are not big in Georgia as far as I'm concerned, but I think they're pretty big in California and some other high density areas. So just know that the IRC for the first time is now addressing some of the issues about these accessory dwelling units. And they have to do with not fire protection, but fire alarm systems, dividing walls, and whether or not the electrical service between them has to be the same or can be separate. And the point is that these regulations may be different than however the ADUs, if it was built 5 or 6 years ago, is configured, and there may be some changes there. And as I said, for the first time, there are code provisions specifically aimed at that situation, and that's brand new.
And you mentioned, and I'm probably going to butcher the term, but I think you mentioned horizontal effects for tornado load requirements. Am I getting that phrase right? Horizontal.
Well, in the tornado loads, it was both horizontal and vertical,
Okay.
because the tornado loads, they can be very high, but they're also uh, they don't last as long. In hurricanes, you have these very powerful sustained winds, and that creates one kind of condition that the structure needs to absorb. But a tornado is very, very fast, but a relatively short duration, and so that's a different kind of design situation.
So for those of us like myself who live in the Midwest, or Jay up in the Northeast, are there ever changes to, and I don't want to call it a vertical load, but think of snow loads, right? Weight on roofs. Are there ever changes that happen with those snow loads in maybe colder weather areas?
I don't think so. No, I mean, the snow loads have been pretty well established, and unless we have more severe climate changes, I don't anticipate snow load have to be different.
Sure.
Uh, there has been more emphasis placed on preventing water intrusion from ice dams, for example, and that goes now to the presence of ice and water shield being placed on roofs. And forgive me, I'm not up on this because I live in Georgia. Our problem in Georgia is kudzu, not ice dams. Okay, Yeah, so I think at one point the code required a certain amount of ice and water shield along 2 feet or so of the eave, and now you've got to be 3 feet or 4 feet, something like that. But that's the kind of change that would happen from climate. Although um, another change is that we now have an energy code. So in addition to an electrical code and a mechanical code, plumbing code, and so forth, there is an energy code. And that has to do with making buildings more airtight so that we don't have as much air changing within a house, and having better insulation, and taking care not to lose too much energy through the windows. So I think those changes will continue over time. And that again is something that you'll have to pay attention to. For a home that was built 40 years ago, they didn't have to have a blower test, and now they do. So that might be part of uh, the process of rehabilitating a structure that was damaged, is to making it more airtight.
Sure. Jay, I want to flip back to you for our final couple of minutes, because I think it's important with the refrigerant changes to talk about the next few years. And you did touch on it, but I think it's valuable to reiterate what is happening starting January 1st of 2025 as far as manufacturing, but the ability to replace, or I should say repair systems versus in the future. Can you just kind of touch on that a little bit as far as those changes in refrigerants are concerned?
Absolutely. Before I do that, I'll jump back real quickly to something Rich was talking about as far as snow loads, ice dams, and things like that. Um, Again, great resource library out there of information. We just did a webinar on that. So we covered ice dams and snow loads, all the things Rich was just talking about. Great education. Go out to our resource site, and that was just last month. So all updated information and really good information for you adjusters out there handling claims where that may be happening. So as far as these regulations and these new refrigerants go, I think that was the question at hand. Is um, really what's happening is we need to lower, per this AIM Act, we need to lower the what's called the GWP, which is the global warming potential. Obviously, we all hear about global warming every day, whether it's on your phone or on your TV or your billboard or your radio. We're all hearing about it, right? So this AIM Act has set forth a global warming potential factor of 700. That is the number. So in layman's terms, let's just say carbon dioxide is 1 on the effect on global warming. So 700 is 700 times greater than carbon dioxide, right? So guess what? R410A and R22 are both over 1800 GWP. They're not even close. So we have to do something else. So these new refrigerant, they're new on the scene, I should say. They're not new. R32 and R454B, they've been around for a while. R32 has been in window air conditioners since 2015, I believe. So it's not new, but they've never been allowed to be used inside a structure, like with a split system. Speaking of codes, every state in the union had a code that says you cannot use these types of refrigerants that are now referred to as A2Ls because they're mildly flammable, right? They're not explosive like propane or gasoline or kerosene, things like that, but they're going to burn if they're high enough concentration and they catch on fire. So all the states had codes said you can't do that. That's why they weren't using these types of refrigerants. Every state in the union over the year 2024 has been scrambling to update that code so we can allow this to happen. So that's a change that adjusters are going to come up against and things like that. And they're going to be hearing these sorts of things out there. So, and then there's going to be new things that are going to have to go along with these refrigerants that are quote unquote mildly flammable, right? You might have to have new training for the technicians. They have to have different spark resistant tools when they work on these things. These systems, these little bit bigger systems are going to have refrigerant leak detection units on them. So if this refrigerant's leaking out in a high concentration space, like a basement or utility closet or things like that, this thing would pick it up kind of like a CO2 detector and shut down the system and things like that. So definitely changes coming with this. It's all happening quickly. Per the AIM Act, no more manufacturing of R410A systems starting January 1, 2025. They're going to have 1 year to sell through the split system equipment and 3 years at this point to sell through the package unit equipment. So light speed changes coming. A lot of information out there. I think even the technicians are scrambling. This is the mom and pop shops out there scrambling to keep up with what's going on with this, how it's going to affect what they can and can't do, and things like that. So it would not surprise me if this is going to be a very complicated year going into 2025 on, answering questions about codes, regulations, things like that related to HVAC claims.
Sure. Well, no, I appreciate that. Reiterating all those facts. And again, to hammer home the fact, Alpine Intel's resource library and resources up on our website, super valuable, ton of information up there. I've touched on the educations. If you need a personalized education for, say, a team of adjusters, reach out to your account manager. We can facilitate those things just so we can get everybody up to speed. I know I've personally been fielding, like I said, phone calls prior to January 1st, 2025 of, hey, this local contractor says it's got to fully be replaced, and it's good for me to let our carrier partners know. That's why it's important to get a professional company like HVACI who is up to speed on those regulations out there to do a professional assessment and speak to those changes and, like you said, repair versus replace. But awesome information. We touched on a lot of stuff, but I personally, again, want to thank you both for joining on this episode of the Savvy Adjuster podcast, and of course, sharing your insight into regulatory changes and how they may impact how claims decisions are made. A lot of good stuff here, gentlemen. So thank you again for joining us.
Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
And it goes without saying, but thanks to everyone who is listening. I think I mentioned it 700 times now, but you can find additional resources about regulations that may further explain these rules and their impact on claims at Alpine Intel's resource page, as well as materials about various property loss topics. And it only takes a second, and I promise it's literally a second, to subscribe to the podcast. So make sure to do that. This will allow you to never miss an episode. A lot of good stuff coming up, not only through the end of the year, but in 2025. And finally, it goes without saying, if you do have property claims that need assessments, you can always submit an assignment on our website, which is always alpineintel.com, or simply get more details about how our suite of services can bring you the answers you need to feel confident about your claims decisions. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you next time.